This is an Urbinary interview. Urbinary. The podcast exploring how we understand and live urban spaces.
Good morning, everyone. Today on Urbinary, we have with us Professor Martin Muller. He's a full professor in the University of Lausanne, and we would like to welcome him. Hello.
Hello, Abdallah.
Thanks a lot for being with us. And we can kick our interview today with yourself introducing yourself to our listeners and share with us how you began researching the topic of mega events. Thanks.
Sure. So hello, everybody who is listening to Urbinary. I ended up working on mega events, so big events like the Olympic Games, the Football World Cups, almost by coincidence. As it often happens in our careers, whether they are academic or your own careers, sometimes they're small coincidences that make you change a whole aspect of your life. So it's like the proverbial bicycle that falls over in China but has a butterfly effect on the other end of the world. I did my PhD research on Russia. So I had lived in Russia for a year. I had learned Russian, and at the end of my PhD, I kind of felt that I wanted to continue working on Russia because I really liked doing research there. And obviously now, fast forward 15 years later, and things have changed massively around Russia. But that's another story. But I, at the time, said, okay, I want to continue working on Russia, use my Russian, but do something that's a little more global. And so at the time, that was in 2008, 2009, Russia had just been awarded the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, the 2014 Games. And so for me, that was a way of saying, hey, you have something global here, but it's based in Russia. And there were very few people working on those games and studying those games, mainly also because of the language barrier. Russian is not an easy language to learn. It's not easy to do field research at the time in Russia. So I started working on this. And then I was based in Switzerland, which is where all the big governing institutions of those events are based. So initially I was in Zurich, which is where FIFA is based. I'm now in Lausanne, so right next to the International Olympic Committee. So that kind of kept me in the mega event loop even after the Sochi Olympic Games had finished. And I started to work much more generally on not just isolated case studies of those events, but to identify really the patterns and also some explanatory elements around the outcomes of mega events. Perfect.
Thanks a lot. Our episode today focuses on the intersection of mega events, tourism, and sustainability. In your opinion, how would you define mass tourism in the context of mega events?
So mass tourism in the context of mega events is very interesting because you could say that it was actually only through mass tourism that those events became mega events, so very big events. Because essentially much of their size comes from the fact that they have a significant number of tourists that come and want to see the athletes compete in real life and not just on the screen. And for allowing mega events to grow so massively, mass tourism was a key ingredient. So the fact that you nowadays can have millions or even tens of millions of visitors to big events like the Olympic Games is closely connected to the fact that mass means of transportation, train, and then the plane later on have become accessible to large proportions of the population. So if you want to go and watch a national team play in the Football World Cup in North America, for example, 60, 70 years ago, that would probably have been difficult, but with the diffusion of travel, this is something that has become ever more accessible to people around the world. And that's also a major driver of revenue in the Olympic Games. So a significant part of the revenue of the Olympic Games actually comes from ticketing. And of course, it's also a major reason why people want to host the Olympic Games, cities and regions, is to refashion the image as a tourist destination. And just to go back to how I initially got into studying mega events, that was the Sochi Olympic Games. And Sochi really had a strong tourism or mass tourism rationale behind it. So they really wanted to develop a new ski resort. Sochi was not known as a ski resort before. And therefore, this mass tourism driver has always been extremely present with mega events.
And do you think there are specific characteristics that differentiate mass tourism in other contexts than the one of mega events?
Yeah, I think there are several things that are a bit different. One is certainly that much of that mass tourism is also mediated through global media. So the reason people want to see their national teams or their favorite athletes compete is also because they've seen them on the media. So it's very strongly linked to the global media landscape. And so I think that's one key difference, right? The strong mediatization of that mass tourism. So the two kind of go hand in hand. The second difference is that mega event tourism, for the most part, is not cheap tourism. When we say mass tourism nowadays, we usually think, big holiday resorts or people lying on beaches or descending en masse on certain destinations. And usually this happens because it's accessible for a large percentage of the population. Mega event tourism is actually relatively expensive, especially if you want tickets to the competitions. So certainly for the Olympic Games, I know for most tickets you're looking at least €100, often several hundreds of euros for one ticket only. And then you have to factor in accommodation, which during the event is also extremely expensive. So you're ending up with significant price tags. So in that sense, it's not democratic mass tourism that everybody could do it, but actually you need to have significant money saved in order to do this. So I would see that as the second difference to the other kinds of mass tourism that you can think of. And maybe the third kind of difference is that it is, in its orientation towards the spectacle and the spectatorship, it is a very different kind of tourism from other kinds where people go to party on beaches or go to certain locations that are of particular interest because they are global tourist attractions. So the fact that there's this ticketing system behind it really also makes for a significant difference to many other types of mass tourism.
Thanks a lot. Very clear. I think Toka now have more questions you would like to inquire.
Okay. Professor Muller, so mega events are often promoted as strategic tourism attractions for host regions. How do they function in this role? And what are their key spatial, social, and economic impacts?
Yeah, so the tourism rationale is often a very strong one. You're absolutely right, Toka, in bidding for mega events. And often in the bidding phase, you have the tourism actors, the local tourism associations, for example, or big owners of properties. For the Winter Olympics, you also have the ski resorts as really major actors in driving those bids forward. Although actually the benefits of mega events for tourism are not so clear cut, actually. So I think we need to distinguish different situations. So research actually shows that mega events only lead to an increase in tourism in very specific situations. In most situations, what they do is they displace tourists that would have come anyway. And that's because mega events often take place in destinations that are already very popular and where many of the hotel rooms would be booked anyway. during that the time when the mega events take place. So often for the Winter Olympics, it's February, so it's the skiing holidays. So often those destinations are not running empty. So they're basically just displacing other people, and often they're displacing people who then say, well, if our destination is becoming kind of this mass tourism destination, we won't go back there anymore. So there's the question also of what image you want to give your destination. If the image is that of more of a mass tourism destination, then that's probably fine. But of course, the trends nowadays in terms of tourism marketing go in exactly the opposite direction. So what nowadays as a tourism destination you want to have is you want to be boutique, you want to be bespoke, you want to be exclusive, and you want the experience that you offer to your clients not to be standardized, not the standardized offer that mega events come with, but you want to at least create the illusion of a very much individualized, customized offer for the tourists that want to visit your destination. So that's the kind of the field of tension which those events are often need to navigate. Why are they still being pushed by tourism associations, even though the benefits are very ambiguous? Well, because it usually means lots of public money flowing into tourism investment. So this is a kind of a lever that you wouldn't have otherwise if you didn't have this event. So it just means being able to tap into public funding. It also means, of course, for property owners, hotel owners, that you're able to rent out your rooms for sometimes 3-4 times the regular price. So it just means higher profits. So often there are just very much vested profit interests behind this, and they're often cloaked or sugar-coated a little bit in this tourism destination development narrative. But of course, the narrative is problematic insofar as well as the effects of mega events on the image or the attraction of a destination are often very temporary. So there's good research that shows that people very quickly forget where the Olympic Games have taken place. So that what is called the recall effect, the number of people who remember where something happened, is actually pretty weak, because you move on to the next Olympic Games immediately. So often, I think that this argumentation that you need mega events to develop a tourist destination or create a new image is sometimes just a narrative that's not very much founded on the research evidence that we have.
And building on that, as you said in your answer right now, so mega events frequently claim to be sustainable, yet your research team has developed a model that challenges these claims. Could you walk us through why these sustainability narratives often fall short? And how your model unpacks this, particularly in mountain regions?
Yeah, so your question kind of needs to be answered perhaps first by saying what sustainability is, because there are many competing definitions. And sustainability can be defined as a good life for all within planetary boundaries. That's essentially what sustainability is nowadays. So the need to have minimum social indicators assured for all people without over-consuming the resources that our planet provides us with. And this discourse of sustainability has been extremely present and important also for the Olympic Games. So they started talking very seriously about the environment from the 1990s onwards, and then in the 2000s, the discourse was moving towards sustainability. Today, there's lots of talk about the Olympics becoming climate neutral or carbon positive, even in the near future. So what we wanted to do is we want to look at the cold hard figures of this. And since there's no model of how to measure sustainability in the Olympic Games, we first developed a measurement model, because you need to consistently identify what you're talking about. So that was a model that you can read up on. It's published in a journal called Nature Sustainability. And if, as a listener, you want to find this, you can just Google this sustainability model, Olympic Games, Nature Sustainability. It's a model with 9 indicators, and we collected data to apply those 9 indicators to the Olympic Games going back until 1992. And so one thing we found was that the sustainability had not improved since then, but it had actually decreased over time. So despite more and more people talking about how sustainable Olympic Games are, they were actually getting less and less sustainable. So how can one explain that? There are a number of things they're playing into this. One is that the Olympic Games have just, on average, been getting bigger and bigger. So just to give you a sense of comparison, if you take the Barcelona Games 1992 and the most recent games in Paris 2024, then you're talking an order of magnitude of ×2, ×3 larger than the Barcelona Games. And so this order, the size means also more infrastructure is needed, and it means more people need to come, need to be fed, need to be accommodated, need to be transported. And much of that also, of course, has immediate impact, for example, on carbon dioxide emissions and global warming. So this is one reason. The other reason why they're becoming less sustainable is that increasingly we see that, for example, the Olympic Games tamper with the rule of law. The rule of law is the laws that are in force in a given society or in a given city. And increasingly, part of the standard procedure of hosting Olympic Games is actually to pass a special law that introduces exceptions to many of the existing laws. So for us, that was one way in which the social sustainability of Olympic Games actually declined over those 30 years that we looked at in our study. And then, I mean, one other thing that you see, and I mean, that's also something you see, for example, in Milano Cortina and preparations for the 26 games, is that Olympic Games consistently go over budget. And so this is one way in which also that economic sustainability that you need is not given. And if we talk very specifically, because that was your other question or about mountain regions, then the thing is there's a twofold element in mountain regions. One element is that, of course, you're in very sensitive ecosystems where smaller interventions have bigger impacts because those are ecosystems that are not as resilient as many other ecosystems. And so if you start building ski jumps and bobsled tracks or grandstands for the spectators, then of course this multiplies the impacts such an infrastructure has, as does the tourists that go there. You know, each tourist in a relatively sensitive mountain region has much more of an impact than if you have this person in, say, a city, for example, like Milan. So that's one thing. The other thing is a much more fundamental one, and it has to do with climate change. Essentially, today, we don't know what the winters will look like in 30 years down the line. We have a rough idea. They'll probably be much warmer. But at the scale of the resolution of individual winter sports resorts, or even at the scale of the Alps, there's significant uncertainty to the degree where we don't know whether we'll be able at all, in fact, to ski in 30 years down the line, even with all the technological artificial snowmaking potential that we have. So this means that if you take sustainability as the idea that something is sustainable in the long run, that you can sustain it, there's a big question mark, actually, whether any of those infrastructures that are getting built now can be sustained over 20, 30, 40 years, given how climate change is progressing at the moment.
Okay. Thank you so much for touching down all these critical points. And Daphne will continue.
Okay. Thank you, Toka. So, if we focus, drawing from your last answer on Winter Olympics, so we'd like to ask, like, hosting the Winter Olympics presents unique challenges. So, as we said, due to the fragile nature of mountain environments and their dependence on natural resources. So, in your opinion, what are the most significant environmental and infrastructural challenges of staging mega events in regions like the Alps, for example?
So the most significant ones are certainly the fact that you have highly specialized infrastructure that's not easily used in versatile ways. Let me give you an example. On a ski jump, you can only do ski jumps. Whereas for example, in the beach volleyball venue for the Olympic Games, you can do lots of other things, right? You can also much more easily make a temporary beach volleyball venue, which is much more difficult with the ski jumps. So the critical issue with the infrastructure in the Winter Games is that it's so specialized that you often only the small group of people who are practicing this sport are able to use it efficiently. And so if you have many of those infrastructures in the same country, then often there's no significant after use, because you don't need 4 bobsleigh runs in a country that only has a handful of teams that compete in this. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is with the Winter Olympic Games infrastructure, is that there's this massive uncertainty around how it's going to be used. So, as a private investor today, would you invest into something where you're not sure whether it's still going to be in demand 20 or 30 years down the line? Probably not, right? So the Winter Olympics are kind of asking that of you, right? They're asking to make an investment and to get your facilities up to date, because they need to be at the cutting edge of technology. But in order for you for anyone to do this in a way that makes sense, you need to be sure that you can use them 30, 40 years afterwards. And so 30, 40 years afterwards, 30 years from now, we're in 2055, where it's extremely likely that we'll have global warming at least 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, probably more extreme weather. So extreme uncertainty over what skiing will look like and winter sports will look like in that period, where there will be enough demand at all for this. And so at the moment, of course, much of this investment is public investment, because understandably, private investors are a little bit reluctant to put too much money into those mountain regions. The question is, of course, what could be done to prevent this? I mean, there are different ways you could go about this. Yeah? One way could be to rethink Olympic winter sports. We've seen an urbanization of winter sports as well. So more and more sports that are being done in urban contexts rather than out in mountain regions. You also have to say that, nowadays there are very few people who practice ski jumping or slalom on a regular basis. These are just not sports that have a very broad base in the general population. And so when you talk about sustainability, the question is also, okay, how much can the sports also encourage people in the general population to take up sports and live a healthy lifestyle? So that question around whether the sports represented in the Olympic program need to be changed is an important one, but it's a difficult one because the governance system of the International Olympic Committee in that regard is very inert and very much unable actually to respond to this, because everybody's defending their sports. Another more obvious example is obviously to reuse venues that are already in existence beyond existing borders as well. So, you could go to another country. I mean, that's partly what has been suggested for the bobsleigh venue for the Milano Cortina Games. One thing that's, of course, absurd is with this reuse, and you can basically see this in comparison with the Olympic Games in Torino in 2006, right? Which had built all those venues, but which in the meantime had fallen into disuse and were no longer usable when the Milano bid came around. So it kind of shows the dangers of building all those venues from scratch. And the third thing perhaps that I would like to mention is that, of course, many of those venues get built because there are people profiting from the money being spent. Very immediately, there are construction contracts, there are politicians who are staking their reputations on those projects and so on. So often this money gets spent for the benefit of a few, but not for the benefit of society at large. And so one thing that needs to change is also the governance of how those funds are being spent. And one way one could do this is to clearly, for example, fix a spending limit. Clearly, only bid for Olympic Games if all of the venues you have are pre-existing, or you can cooperate with other countries to use those venues. But we've seen that this is not necessarily very much welcomed at the moment by the International Olympic Committee. Switzerland made such a bid for the Winter Olympic Games 2030 exactly. But the response was from the IOC that no, it's too much spread out across the country, and we need to cluster it a little more. And the idea to spread out across the country was obviously to make use of venues that are already in existence, but that are not all in the same place, and to also spread the benefits a little bit more, and not have mass tourism, because we spoke about that. So tourism massed in one place, but spread more evenly across the country. So you wouldn't have this infrastructural surges of demand in specific places. So the solutions are out there. At the moment, we just don't have the structures to implement those solutions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So I think you mentioned this earlier, but would like to draw some attention on the legacy of mega events as a critical issue. So the Winter Olympics require highly specialized venues that are costly to build and maintain, and makes them susceptible to becoming white elephants. So perhaps firstly you could give a small definition about white elephants, and then we would like your opinion on what strategies could help prevent this, and beyond what has already been proposed in the International Olympic Committee's agenda for 2020.
Yeah. So white elephants are, by definition, infrastructures built but then not used anymore at all, or not used to capacity or to their original purpose. So you can have white elephants that fall completely into disuse. Often that's the case with extremely specialized infrastructure, like the ski jumps, for example, or the bobsleigh run, because they're extremely costly to maintain. Maintaining a bobsleigh run costs so often a couple of hundreds of thousands or even millions per year if you want to do it properly. Then there's infrastructure that's not used to capacity. So for example, you can look at the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, which was built for the 2008 Games. It has a capacity of, I think, 70 or 80,000 people. But nowadays, it's very rarely used for that many people. It still hosts stuff, but not actually for at the capacity that it was built for. And the other version of a white elephant is just something that was built for one thing, but then needed to be converted into another thing in order to function well. And often this is a conversion that comes at a significant cost. you can look at the Olympic Stadium in London 2012 as a white elephant in that sense, because it was an athletic stadium, and in order for it to find a tenant that would rent it later on, it had to be converted into a football stadium, and which is not, you don't do that with a snap of your fingers. So it cost, I think, several hundreds of millions of pounds, I think, even to do this conversion. So in that sense, this was also a white elephant because it was not used for its original purpose. So the question is, how can we prevent those white elephants? One thing is that some of them are already getting prevented. That's partly because the International Olympic Committee is looking a little bit more closely at what's happening with the venues and insists that ideally very few new venues would get built. Now, the problem is with the IOC that they don't pay for the venues, so they can make recommendations and apply some pressure, but in the end, if a city says, well, you can't tell us what we do because we are paying for that and not you. And that's part of their development strategy. And sometimes there's this legacy discourse. We want to leave a legacy, and often they think of legacy as a material legacy. And then often the International Olympic Committee has very little leverage on this. The second element, which could help preventing white elephants, is having private co-investment in venues. Because the private sector is usually much more careful in investing only in things that are going to make a profit down the line. So having shared financing that would not be only public or only private could actually be an interesting way of correcting for some of the money that flows into those white elephant infrastructures. At the very end, I think you need to ask a much more fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, if those events are making us build stuff that we don't need later on, why should we host those events in the first place? And I think many cities have asked that question of themselves, and they said, no. Well, in that case, actually, our answer is we shouldn't host those events. They're not helping us in any way towards an efficient use of our resources or an efficient development of our infrastructure. They are actually squandering money on very specialized infrastructure that has very limited public benefit afterwards. So sometimes I think this is, for many cities, this is actually the most important question to ask.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So mega events are largely about spectacle, from the opening ceremonies to the competitions and the closing celebrations. How do these events reshape the way people experience mountain territories, both during and after the event?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, what do you look for in mountains, right? And I think, for many people, when they go to the mountains, they're looking for a kind of dissociation or a retreat or some escapism from society. So often the mountains are also culturally imagined as a wilderness, as a rough place, as a cold place, also as an authentic place, an original place, right? Now, of course, we all know that this imaginary is constructed and is often also maintained by tourism actors as well. Switzerland, where I'm based, has a very strong narrative of the mountains as authentic and steeped in traditions and intact place also, an intact place, an untouched place, an unspoiled place as well, where we can get away from civilization and all the ills of civilization, be it climate change or environmental destruction or pollution and so on. So this is a bit the imaginary of mountains as we have them at the moment. So of course, mega events don't fit into this imaginary, right? Because as you rightly said, they are a spectacle. So a spectacle means they are big, they are large, they pull things off that are out of the ordinary. They're often also very technological, both in the large media presence that is implied, but also in the technological advances that are being used to construct many of the stadia, for example. So they change those imaginaries of mountains, and increasingly mountains then become something to be consumed rather than to be experienced. So we are moving. Guy Debord, a French sociologist, spoke of the society of the spectacle, and initially was only referring really to television in particular as a medium that was presenting people with mediated experiences rather than immediate experiences, for example, of nature, but also of other people. And in many ways, the mountains have been a retreat from that mediation, something where you could experience something authentic, original, unmediated, actually. And of course, mega events are changing that, and they are also bringing the mountain into the mediated sphere. And the reason, of course, why they do this is because if something becomes mediated, it can be sold to many more people at the same time. So an unmediated experience requires your personal presence. But if you have a mediated experience, you can relay that experience, transmit that experience, or broadcast that experience, in the case of the Olympic Games, to people around the world without those people ever having to go to the mountains. So for me, that changes what mountain territories are about, and it also changes the kind of things that people look for in mountains. You know, if nowadays many look for distance or some kind of some kind of even inspiration. I think much more often through mega events, we find the very opposites, or a strong sort of consumerism that's linked to mountain territories.
Thanks a lot, Martin. I think we had a very interesting and very rich talk. Maybe we can wrap up with a final reflection, looking into the Italian context more specifically, since we are in Italy, and comparing Cortina 1956 to Cortina 2026, but also the experience from Turin 2006. And always according to you, do you think we are repeating the same patterns in terms of bidding on the same attractive models for tourism, attracting tourism, or is there a more sustainable approach this time?
So if you ask me, the Olympic Games in the 1950s were much more sustainable than the ones we have now. So we've not become more sustainable, we've become less sustainable over time. I don't know much about the Cortina Games, but I know quite a bit about the games that happened 8 years before. That was in 1948, because they were the last Olympic Games hosted in Switzerland, in St. Moritz, just across the border. Why would I qualify those as sustainable? Well, because they essentially were relatively small. They had completely untechnologized venues. They actually took place with lots of snow and lots of ice. If you see the pictures from that period, those were really games where you didn't have to worry about having enough snow. And the way that the Olympic Games have been going, and our society in general has been going, has obviously been towards a strong growth, both in economic terms, but also in the consumption of resources, whether this resource is clean air, whether this is any mineral resources we have, or whether it's clean water, et cetera, et cetera. And so the problem is that the main function of the Olympic Games 50, 60, 70 years ago is still the same as it is today. It's to allow people from around the world to compete peacefully among themselves. But what has changed is that 50, 60 years ago, this was a competition mainly between athletes, and you had some people interested in watching those games. and coming to those places where they can be watched. And nowadays, it's become basically an industry that is as much about making money as it is about the sports. Just to give you one example, for the Summer Games, for example, you have around 10,000 athletes competing, which is kind of the core that you need. Whereas you have around 400,000 accredited people that are doing other things to make the Olympic Games work, and you have perhaps around 10 million visitors. And so it's that part that has grown significantly. So if you ask me, I know you don't need to go back to the 1940s and 1950s, right? But some of the things that they did back then were actually quite interesting and can be looked at again today if we want to make those games more sustainable. If you combine them with some of the technological solutions we have today in terms of transmitting television footage of competitions into the furthest corner of the planet, transmitting them in high quality on really big screens and creating public viewing experiences, then I think we have some key ingredients for how those events could become infrastructurally sustainable for the cities that host them, climate sustainable for the world as a whole by reducing climate emissions, but also socially sustainable for the people who live in those cities, who often actually are on the sidelines of that spectacle because they often don't get the tickets to go to those events that are being held in their city and for which they've experienced and sometimes suffered from the preparations and the disruptions of those preparations in the city for a couple of years. So in that sense, actually, maybe looking to the past and going back to the past might actually mean that some things get more interesting and get better rather than worse.
Thanks a lot, Martin. This was very rich interview. I think we were able to conclude within the hour time frame, and I hope we didn't take too much of your time.
Not at all. It was very interesting. It made me think about some questions that I hadn't thought about in a while. The connection to tourism, I've written on this, but I haven't. It's not something that I get interviewed about very often. So that was quite interesting, and it's good to get back into the Winter Games mode again, because I've been thinking Summer Games with the Paris Games for a long time, and now it's Winter Games mode again.
We are back to the winter. Also interesting because Cortina was the one, maybe that started this decline. It was the first televised Winter Games, so it helped with expanding the marketing strategies, maybe. I think I'm not so much about televised games, right? It came across a little bit harshly there, because much of the televisation actually nowadays also presents potential in terms of reducing in-person trips. But I think it becomes problematic at the point where it's being used as a way of creating additional demand for in-person trips to sell tickets and then blow up the size of the events even more. Of course. Okay, I think if Alessandro gave us the sign, so we're fine?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Urbinary is produced in collaboration with Polyradio and the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano.